Well, because this is the final of the 4 Nevin lectures, then I want to say again, thank you for inviting me to come and give these. I'm deeply honored to be here with you. Peter Leithart is one of the great blessings of God to the church today, and I've had the privilege to work with him in several other settings. And it's just wonderful to have the Trinity Institute located here in Birmingham. And I personally hope that these Nevin lectures will be the beginning of an increasingly strong relationship between the Institute, this church, and Beeson Divinity School. We are in the service of the church. That's why we exist. We're not simply an academic center for the study of religion, though we hope what we do is academically above average. But we really exist to prepare God-called ministers for the service of the church. And this is a wonderful strengthening of that purpose. So I do want to say, again, because this is the last lecture, thank you for listening so well. I know, or at least I have good reason to assume, that not all of you have agreed with everything I said. Yet you have acted like you were interested in the subject. And there is not a greater compliment you can give to a speaker than to listen to what he tries to say. You've done that well. Thank you. Now, this is the lecture in which I give kind of a tribute, a personal tribute, to John Williamson Nevin and Philip Schaff, a Baptist appreciation for these two great figures. But I don't want to begin in Mercersburg. We'll get there in a minute. I want to start in New York City. I want to start at a school, Union Theological Seminary, where Philip Schaff actually taught for a number of years after he left Mercersburg. And I want to begin in 1930. Schaff had long been dead, and of course Nevin, who died in 1886. But there was a visitor to Union Theological Seminary in the fall, actually through the whole academic year of 1930, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He had come to the United States on his first American visit. It was a treacherous time in Germany. The Weimar Republic was always shaky and seemed to be unraveling. The Nazis were on the rise, were about to seize power. On July the 31st, Bonhoeffer had delivered his inaugural lecture as a professor of systematic theology at the University of Berlin. His dissertation was on ecclesiology, Sanctorum Communio, the communion of saints. He was clearly one of the most highly trained and promising young theologians in Germany at the time, and he was offered the 1-year Sloan Fellowship to come to America, to come to Union, and he was granted a 1-year leave of absence to do that. Well, he's left us some of his impressions of his visit. They're not all negative by any means, but I wanted to read a couple of the comments he made about what he observed when he came to that seminary where Philip Schaff had taught in 1930. The intellectual preparation for the ministry here is extraordinarily thin, he said. A seminary, this is a seminary in which it comes about. One day Bonhoeffer gave a presentation on Luther's doctrine of the bondage of the will. He said this is a seminary in which it can come about that a large number of students laugh out loud in a public lecture at the quoting of a passage from Luther's De Servo Arbitrio on sin and forgiveness, because it seems to them to be comic. And this seminary has evidently completely forgotten what Christian theology by its very nature stands for. And then he wrote a treatise summarizing his assessment theologically, not just of Union, but of the kind of American Christianity he observed. It's entitled Protestantismus ohne Reformation. Protestantism without the Reformation. God has granted American Christianity no reformation. He has given it strong revivalist preachers, churchmen, theologians, but no reformation of the Church of Jesus Christ by the Word of God. Anything of the churches of the Reformation which has come to America either stands in conscious seclusion and detachment from the general life of the church, or has fallen victim to Protestantism without reformation. Now, of course, what Dietrich Bonhoeffer is describing in this treatise, what he observed at Union Theological Seminary in 1930, was not distinctive to that school. It was typical of what has come to be called mainline liberal Protestantism. A thin, anemic version of Protestant Christianity, without creeds, without charisma. Not only Protestantism without the Reformation, but also Christianity without Christology. A church whose watchwords, even in 1930, were already tolerance and relevance. This kind of Christianity that Bonhoeffer observed was not only a million miles from Luther and Calvin and the Puritans, from Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield and John Wesley and Alexander, Muhlenberg, and Hodge. It was also a million miles from Mercersburg, where two great leaders, John Williamson Nevin and Philip S. Schaff, called the church to a Protestantismus mit Reformatio, Protestantism with and based on the Reformation. But their call went largely unheeded. And by 1930, Bonhoeffer was astute enough to know that what he was seeing was a departure from what once had been and what might have been. Who were Nevin and Schaff? Well, all of you may know that answer already, and if so, I'll just review briefly. A thumbnail biographical sketch of Nevin, followed by an even briefer biographical sketch of Schaff. And then I want to end this talk by saying a little bit about my own personal indebtedness as a historian, as a theologian, to Nevin and Schaff and to the Mercersburg theology, to which they contributed so much. John Williamson Nevin was born in 1803. He died in 1886. One of his biographers has said that his work was wrought in obscurity. And this was true to a great extent. And why is that? Why do we no longer remember him except for the faithful few? Well, there are several reasons, and one of his most recent biographers, D.G. Hart, has pointed to some of these. For one thing, although he was brought up in a good, solid Presbyterian tradition and educated at Princeton, he had left the Presbyterian Church and united himself with the German Reformed Church. That was a very small denomination at the time. And he was called to teach at a tiny, tiny place called Mercersburg. Well, if you visit Mercersburg today, you won't find many signs of Nevin or Schaff around. I think there's a plaque. The building itself, or some of the buildings that were used in those days, are now a boarding school. It's a beautiful place still. It's located in southern Pennsylvania in a rural area, not very far, just slightly north of the Mason-Dixon line. But you will not find Mercersburg Seminary there anymore. Years and years and years ago, it was absorbed into what is today Lancaster Theological Seminary. And the denomination to which Schaff and Nevin belong, the German Reformed Church, has been absorbed by what is now the United Church of Christ. Arguably, the most liberal denomination in Americanism. They may get a little run for the money from the Unitarian Universalist Association, but it would be a close race. Nevin and Schaff were very different individuals in style and personality and in training and background. Schaff was a Swiss-born, German-trained theologian who came to America and spent most of his life, the rest of his life here. Nevin was an American-born theologian who fell in love with German as a language, as a culture, and to some extent as a theology, immersed himself in it. And yet there was a confluence of interest and passion between these two people that had great good, not only at Mercersburg, but for the church at large. When a certain American visited Germany, had a conference with the great German Catholic scholar, historian Dullinger, Ignaz von Dullinger, and asked him what American theologians could he talk about, what that are outstanding. What theologians America had produced? It's a question for Dullinger. And he answered, only two, Channing and the German Reformed pastor Nevin. Channing, William Ellery Channing, was the leader of Unitarianism in Boston. And John Williamson Nevin, the leader of what became called the Mercersburg theology. So I want to give a little background on Nevin and then say a little bit about Schaff. Nevin was born on a farm in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, of Scotch-Irish ancestry. His family was old-fashioned Presbyterian. Some of his ancestors had actually been involved in the American Revolution and had served with the Continental Congress. At age 14, which was not all that unusual at the time, he was sent to Schenectady, New York, where he enrolled as a student at Union College. It was while he was at Union College in Schenectady that the campus experienced a revival in which Nevin confessed that he became a Christian. He was, to some extent, caught up in this revival, though he would have reservations and doubts about it. He never denied what happened to him there. If you want to know something of the atmosphere of what that revival might have been like at Union College when young John Nevin was there, I recommend that you read some of the letters written by Emily Dickinson when she was a student just a few years later at Mount Holyoke Seminary in New England. They too experienced a campus-wide revival while Emily Dickinson was there. There was great pressure for her to make a profession of faith, to become a Christian. She resisted that pressure. She talks about this in great explicit detail. Fascinating discussion. Well, something like that also happened at Union College when Nevin was there. He did not, at the end of the day, resist whatever pressure had been brought on him to respond to the revival. I mention this because, of course, this will become a big, big issue for him and for the Mercersburg theology. And I think the fact that he had undergone this kind of evangelical revival experience as an impressionable teenager, adolescent, must have marked his sensitivities in certain ways for the rest of his life. He did well at Union. He was not in the most robust of health. He never was in the most robust of health, even to the end of his life. And so after college, he found it necessary to take a couple of years in which he lived on the farm with his family before going to Princeton Theological Seminary, where he did very well as a student. And when the great Charles Hodge, one of his teachers, decided to take a leave of absence to study in Germany for 2 years, Nevin was chosen to fill in for him. And he was actually a professor, a teacher at Princeton Theological Seminary, filling in for Charles Hodge. When Hodge returned in 1830, Nevin was called to a brand new seminary called at that time Western Seminary in the town of Allegheny, Pennsylvania. Western has evolved into, over a period of changes, what is now called Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. It's still a Presbyterian seminary today. But still young John Nevin spent actually 10 years there. That's an important 10 years in his life. That was the period when he really began to immerse himself in German as a language. Primarily so he could read the writings of the great Neander, one of the great German historians, church historians of the time, with whom his erstwhile colleague Philip Schaff actually studied in Germany. But Neander, in a way, is the grandfather to Mercersburg theology. He was the person who influenced directly Schaff and very indirectly but deeply Nevin. And if I may be so bold as to make a suggestion, he would be a good topic for somebody to talk about at the Trinity Institute someday. Not as well known in America as he should be. This was also the time when the Presbyterian denomination in America was in the process of splitting into two. Those of you who think that's a recent phenomenon in Presbyterian history, you're wrong. In fact, all major denominations were splitting in the early 19th century, if they hadn't already split before then, brought about by the Great Awakening and the impact of the awakening within the churches. The Baptist and Congregationalists in New England split into New Lights and Old Lights. Roland Bainton used to joke and say about the Congregationalists that they began as old lights, they became new lights, and now they're all twilights. But this was not only a Baptist congregational thing, it impacted every denomination, including Presbyterians, who divided into new school, old school. I think it may say something interesting about the genetic makeup and the DNA of these two Christian groups, that the Baptists were called lights and the Presbyterian schools. Well, in 1838, the schism had among the Presbyterians, the old and new school Presbyterians, had ripened and was actually taking place. Nevin at that time attended the presbytery, which had to vote on which side they would go with. New school, old school. Nevin found himself bound to stand with the old school side. That was his family's background. That's basically the tradition of Princeton when he was there. So he sided with the old school Presbyterians. But it's worthy to think about that he made a request that an entry be made on the records of his presbytery to the effect that in voting his adherence to the old school assembly, he was not by any means voting to unchurch the new school Presbyterians or to deny it legitimate succession within the Reformed family of churches. Later, when the new school and the old school got back together and mended the schism, which happened during Nevin's lifetime, he remembered the fact that back then in 1838, he had reached out in an ironic, unifying way in the midst of what was a very fractious controversy. I think that's a telling example because it kind of gets at the heart of this quest for Christian unity that was always motivating the Mercersburg school. In 1840, Nevin was called to Mercersburg, which at that time was a very small, always struggling financially institution, a seminary of the German Reformed Church. The first thing he did in terms of publication was to write a series of articles on the Heidelberg Catechism. Now, the Heidelberg Catechism has a very important, almost, domineering role within the Mercersburg theology. The Heidelberg Catechism was published in 1563. It came from the Palatinate, Heidelberg, in Germany. And it was largely drafted by a theologian named Ursinus. It's a fabulous statement of Reformation theology. Adopted eventually as a doctrinal standard in the Dutch Reformed Church as well. But Nevin wanted the Heidelberg Catechism to be better known, and so he wrote these articles, a series of long, substantive articles on the history, the theology of the Heidelberg Catechism. One of the marks of Mercersburg theology is its appeal to the classic creeds and confessions of the church. And maybe its ultimate literary expression was the 3-volume work Philip Schaff edited called Creeds of Christendom. Still in print today, I think. Creeds of Christendom. It was the most comprehensive collection of creeds and confessions going right back to the Apostles' Creed, all the Reformation confessions and beyond. Until just a few years ago, the great Yaroslav Pelikan published an even more definitive collection of creeds and confessions of the church. Until then, until just 5 or 10 years ago, right before he died, Pelikan published this. Until then, Schaff's collection was the standard work anybody would refer to. And Schaff and Nevin wanted these creeds and confessions not only to be known about and studied in an academic way, a resource for scholars to quote and call on. They wanted them to be living documents in the life of the church, nurturing the faith of believers. Well, Nevin's call to Mercersburg coincided with this intense revivalist fervor that was consuming most of the eastern part of the country, east of the Mississippi at the time. And it also affected many of the congregations within the German Reformed Church. It was this event, or this happening, the revivalist movement, that brought out Nevin's first polemical salvo. James Hastings Nichols, who's one of the great scholars of Mercersburg and biographer of Nevin, interpreter of Nevin, once said that Nevin entered Mercersburg and the German Reformed Church like a cavalry charge. And his entire career was marked by the slashing, thrusting charge and countercharge of a cavalry battle. And in this way, he was rather different from Philip Schaff, who could also write polemical theology, but in a little different tone and maybe with not as much fire and heat as Nevin did. I'm not saying that Nevin was a cantankerous person. By all records, he was a very sweet, mild-mannered, affable kind of person, unless you got him in a theological fight. And then, to use a pugilistic term earlier by Peter Lightheart, he took off the gloves. And so this came out in response to a local occasion. It was his own church. There was only one in Mercersburg, German Reformed Church. It's where Nevin and most of the students and faculty at the small school attended. And one of Nevin's former students from Princeton, a person he had known when he taught at Princeton years ago, had been invited to come and preach, as we Baptists say, I don't know if you all use this term as Presbyterians, in view of a call. So he was a prospective pastor preaching a trial sermon on a Sunday night. And of course, Nevin, being a good church-going person, was there. And this particular preacher had been much taken up with the fervor, the flash and fire of the revival movement, and he brought that right into the congregation that Sunday night, with people shouting and emoting and responding all over the congregation. And at the very end of his sermon, this is what really made Nevin respond the way he did. This visiting preacher brought out what was called the anxious bench. The anxious bench was a kind of altar or place of prayer which people would be invited to come and to receive Christ, to make a profession of faith, to pray, usually in the midst of great emotional intensity. Well, this preacher had a traveling edition of the anxious bench, and he brought it out in a portable anxious bench, put it in front of the church, invited. And of course, people did respond. I mean, the place was a beehive of activity. But at the end of the service, Nevin, who was presiding, was called on to say a few words of closure, I suppose. And he actually made a speech about why such activity, while it might give the appearance of external results, was really deeply flawed as a method of evangelism and conversion. And he warned against the kind of subjectivism, enthusiasm, sensationalism that the anxious bench represented. He later wrote a treatise called The Anxious Bench, published in 1844. It's one of his first treatises, in which he reviews the whole phenomenon of what were called the new measures. This is a term that comes from Charles Grandison Finney, who was not a Baptist, but I think a Presbyterian of sorts, but had not studied even at Princeton or anywhere else. He was a lawyer, I think, by training, and had been greatly caught up in the new measures of revivalism, using all kinds of methods and means to stir up a crowd, to get the crowd excited and enthusiastic in sensationalistic ways. And the anxious bench was one of Finney's contrivances, is what Nevin called it. And so in this book, The Anxious Bench, Nevin attacked what he called the quackery of the new measures, Finneyism, another name he uses for it, and the anxious bench. It led to, he said, an emphasis on justification by feelings rather than justification by faith. Now, what I want to do in this next little section is to review only in the most itemizing, cursory way, because we don't have time, some of the big controversies and issues. The anxious bench and revivalism and Finneyism was the first one, but there were other big issues that kind of gave shape to Mercersburg theology. Schaff arrived in Mercersburg in 1844. I'm going to say a little bit more about his background in just a minute, but that began the most fruitful collaboration, one of the most fruitful collaborations, certainly in American Christianity, between Philip Schaff and John Williamson Nevin. Schaff gave an inaugural address that was later republished, related to the Protestant spirit, a new statement of the Protestant tradition and what it could mean in the context in which he found himself working in frontier Pennsylvania. Nevin also gave actually an article, an essay, called Catholic Unity, which opposed, on the one hand, Romanism, and on the other hand, American sectarianism. This dual thrust, this dual polemical thrust against Romanism, which he distinguished very carefully and strongly from Catholicism. Catholicism was a good thing. Romanism had its problems. But he made that distinction, on the one hand, and this kind of sectarian New Measures revivalist impulse, which led to the fracturing of the church into many different sects and groupings. This was a significant sermon, Catholic Unity, and it was actually published alongside Schaff's inaugural address in one single volume. It was the last time in print that Nevin ever referred to the papacy as Antichrist. Those of you that know your confessions know that's a term that had been used before in the Reformed tradition. Second, the church question. The church question referred to the way in which the church was to be understood and promoted. It emphasized the organic nature of the church and the continuity of the church throughout time. The continuity didn't lead to Romanism, to use the term Nevin was using at the time. It was not a continuity that flowed in pipeline succession, a series of bishops going back to Peter, the first bishop of Rome, the first pope according to Catholics. But it did indicate that God had not abandoned or forsaken the church in this intervening time between the apostles and the reformers. What Nevin was opposing was what he called extreme naked Protestantism, a kind of Calvinism that was stripped of all of its churchly elements. That would become one of the marks of the Mercersburg theology, this note on the continuity of the church throughout time. Well, this was also Philip Schaff's emphasis. In fact, in that inaugural address he gave in 1844, he had reviewed the history of the church and had referred in some positive ways to some of the things that happened in the Middle Ages. Medieval Christianity. Well, that was just unheard of in the circles in which Presbyterians and strong Calvinists were living at the time, and there was a strong reaction against Schaff for referring to the positive, constructive, wonderful things God had done during the Middle Ages. It was all darkness until the light of the Reformation. This is how Calvin's motto for the city of Geneva was understood. Post tenebras lux. After the darkness, light. Well, the darkness were the intervening Middle Ages between the early apostolic time and the Reformation, and we shouldn't be fishing around for whatever good nugget we might find in that sea. So serious was the opposition to Schaff that he was actually tried for heresy because of this. Well, the third issue I want to mention is maybe the most dominant one in the Mercersburg theology, and that was the focus on the mystical presence. That was the title, actually, of a treatise by Nevin. And here they're looking particularly at the roots of Reformed theology between Zwingli on the one hand and Calvin on the other, with reference in particular to the Lord's Supper. This treatise, Mystical Presence, provoked a reaction from his great contemporary and former teacher, Charles Hodge. And that contest between the two is one of the classic theological debates in American Christianity. What was Nevin after in all of this? What was he trying to do? Well, I think he was trying to make the point that the central fact of the gospel is the incarnation. John 1:14, a verse that he quoted again and again. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. The enfleshment of the Logos in Jesus Christ was the key not only to understanding the gospel and the Bible, but also to understanding the history of the church and the way in which God's people had worshipped across the centuries. And so he wanted to emphasize, with reference to the Lord's Supper, the mystical union, participation of believers As Calvin talks about the Lord's Supper in such beautiful language, our hearts being lifted up to heaven by the Holy Spirit, where we commune with Christ in the heavenly sanctuary. This is what happens in the Eucharist. Not just a reflection on Jesus died for us on the cross, and isn't that wonderful? I mean, that's a part of it, of course. But there is not just the remembrance of an absent Savior, but the communion with a present Savior. It's interesting that this got him into a little bit of trouble with Hodge on several fronts, one of which was the idea that the doctrine of predestination gets sidelined in this construal. The doctrine of the decrees of God in eternity. How do you square that with this focus on union with Christ in the Eucharist? And Nevin actually came to a slightly changing of his views on this question, to recognize that while you certainly have to say predestination is a major theme in Calvin and Reformed theology, the decrees of God as understood in Reformed scholasticism is not at the heart of Calvin's theology. Rather, it is union with Christ. And it goes back to the Heidelberg Catechism, which is a somewhat mediating document in a way on this question. And the Heidelberg Catechism, Nevin knew, had been written by Ursinus in Heidelberg, the Palatinate. Ursinus had been a student of Philip Melanchthon, who approached, if not completely identified with, Calvin's understanding of the Eucharist, but had a somewhat different construal of the decrees of God and predestination. And so Nevin and others tried to make the point that it was really Melanchthon who, in some way, should be recovered as a founder of the German Reformed Church. Not Zwingli, for sure, and Calvin, yes, to some extent, but let's go back and pick up Melanchthon again. So we get a little Lutheranism here, although it's a Melanchthonian Lutheranism. Well, that did not win the argument of the day, and still hasn't. But it's a fascinating way of thinking about the Reformation, and particularly the role of the Heidelberg Catechism in it. One other issue is the liturgical renewal of the church. Here, Schaff and Nevin worked together on a liturgical commission, reviewing and changing and making proposals about the prayers, the hymns, the litanies that would be central in the reform of the church that they were seeking. And one of the most important things they did, I think, was to contribute to liturgical renewal within the Reformed tradition. Whereas at Princeton, it was more bare-bones Puritanism in a way, naked Protestantism, to use Nevin's term. But this liturgical renewal of the church was something they bequeathed to others who came after them. Well, in 1850, remember he only came in 1840, 10 years at Mercersburg, Nevin resigned. He resigned partly for financial reasons. Mercersburg was always operated on a shoestring. They just didn't have money to pay his salary and Schaff's salary. Well, Schaff said, I'll resign, and let's get Nevin to stay. It shows the spirit, I think, of the two and how they esteemed one another. But that wasn't only financial. There were also personal reasons. At this time, Nevin experienced what was called, in those days, nervousness. Nervousness was probably a code term for what we might call today severe anxiety or depression of some kind, because Nevin seemed to have a great difficulty during the 1850s to actually function as a professor of theology. And so he went into a kind of semi-retirement, but he never stopped writing, working, or publishing, even until the day he died. He was working on projects. But it was during the 1850s that Nevin in particular began to seriously examine the question, why shouldn't I be a Roman Catholic? He had long been accused of being a crypto-papist. So why shouldn't he actually do what his critics have accused him of already doing secretly? This is happening at the same time that one of the leading intellectual lights of New England, Orestes Brownson, had also become a Roman Catholic, become a vigorous apologist for Roman Catholicism. There's correspondence between Nevin and Orestes Brownson. And Nevin seriously considers this. So much so that Philip Schaff is concerned about him and writes to admonish him, to encourage him not to make this step for various reasons. This creates some tension between Schaff and Nevin. And later, when Nevin's biography is being written, Schaff interviews the person who's writing it interviewed Schaff, and Schaff made clear that he wanted, in the chapter on the Mercersburg theology, for his view not to be equated with Nevin's in the Romanist direction in which it seemed to be going during the 1850s. Well, the bottom line is Nevin never did swim the Tiber. He looked at it carefully, examined it thoughtfully, but at the end of the day felt that there were serious problems with Roman Catholic ecclesiology, particularly with reference to the authority of the Church, which in my own personal view is still today the major obstacle between Roman Catholic and evangelical Protestant union authority. There are other issues, of course, but I think that's the main one. It seemed to be so for Nevin as well. He remains within the German Reformed Church, writing, contributing, particularly on the liturgical commission. He and Schaff worked together long after both had left Mercersburg. Well, at the end of his life, Schaff, and at the end of Nevin's life, Schaff looked back on it and spoke with great personal warmth, and spoke about the fact that Nevin had not only been a scholar and a theologian, but also a pastor, about how he had made time during all of his teaching career, Princeton, Western, Allegheny, and Mercersburg, to leave his study and lecture room and spend time with the students, counseling, helping, praying with them. And he was also referred to as the true Puritan. Now, Puritanism is a term that, like Calvinism, can be understood in many different ways, but Richard Storrs defined Puritanism in a way that seemed to fit Nevin exactly. An intense conviction of apprehended truth, a masterful sincerity, a majestic ideal, a superb and shining courage. Well, if those are marks of Puritanism, one wants to say Nevin was a Puritan. And one scholar, writing in 1891, shortly after Nevin had died, said, "If there was in him the austere spirit of a Hebrew prophet, there was something more. Rather, let us say, if there was in him the spirit of the Bonageries, sons of thunder, there was also, and much more, the spirit of him who had beheld the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth, and who to his latest days bore witness of him who is the true God and eternal life. The glory of Christ, his unique personality, his headship over the church, over humanity, over the world, his testimony in the Scriptures. That was that apprehended truth for which he contended with superb and shining courage." I'm going to switch to Schaff now, give an even briefer overview of Schaff, and then make some closing comments about my own indebtedness to both of these people, in particular to Schaff. Unlike Nevin, who was born in a sturdy, comfortable, if not exactly rich, at least well-to-do farming family in Pennsylvania, and to the best of our knowledge, really never lacked for sustenance in life, even though school couldn't pay his salary half the time. Nonetheless, Schaff had a very different background. He was born in Switzerland in the town of Chur. That's in the Italian-speaking region of Switzerland. Our best evidence, though a lot of this is still lost in obscurity, is that he was the illegitimate child of a very poor woman, born in a remote corner of a small country, with little advantages to get on in life. He spent some time in a boarding school where he came in touch with a kind of spirit of revivalism, or of pietism, may be the better word for it, in Europe, and was deeply impacted by it, as was Nevin, but in a different way, in a more positive way. And one of the differences between the two is the relative openness with which Schaff looks at the various sects and schisms that arose in the context of American revivalism. You see this when he's at Union Theological Seminary and D.L. Moody brings his campaign to New York City. Schaff encourages his students to go and participate in the Moody Sankey event. I rather doubt Nevin would have done that. I've already mentioned Neander as being kind of the grandfather of the whole Mercersburg movement. Neander was Schaff's great teacher in Berlin. And he tells about going into his study and there seeing his motto spelled out on a board on the wall. Pectum est quod theologum facit. The heart is what makes one a theologian. This heart religion, very much at the center of Schaff, kind of German pietism. When he came to America, he said there are three great fronts on which the church must fight. One, Roman Catholicism. So he could share some of Nevin's early anti-Catholic, anti-Christ kind of comments. They both kind of left that language behind fairly soon. The second was sectarianism, the same problem that Nevin faced with the Anxious Bench. And the third, rationalism, by which Schaff meant in particular the kind of teaching represented by people like David Friedrich Strauss in the mid-19th century, who denied the miraculous in the Bible, who gutted so much of the kerygma itself. These three great fronts, Catholicism in its Romanist version, sectarianism in its vociferous splitting apart of the church for very often frivolous reasons, and in rationalism, the spirit of the age. Like Nevin, he advocated the liturgical and pastoral use of the creeds and confessions of the church, especially the Heidelberg Catechism. He catechized his own children in his family using the Heidelberg Catechism. He emphasized as much or more, maybe, and certainly as much as Nevin, the Christian year and the importance of following the liturgical calendar. This was another mark of the Mercersburg theology. Hymns of the church, great hymns of the church that should be sung with vigor. He would like this church here. He left Mercersburg to go to New York City, where he became involved in lots of different kinds of activities. The Evangelical Alliance, which was a pan-evangelical movement of churches and associations aiming for Christian unity. And also, this may be a little surprising or not, he became the chairman of the Sabbath Observance Committee. This was a time of great Sabbatarian emphasis within a certain sector of American Christianity, and Philip Schaff was gung-ho in favor of it, led the effort, in fact, to keep the Lord's Day separate, set apart in law as well as church practice, because of the effect it would have on society. Well, As I say, Schaff at Union Theological Seminary stayed on until he died in the early 1890s. One of the things he did was to found, he did this in his own home in New York City, the American Society of Church History, which still exists today, and once or twice has acknowledged that Philip Schaff is its founder. And it's really in his role as a church historian that I feel my own indebtedness to him and to Mercersburg in some ways in a most palpable way. I had the privilege of studying at Harvard with one of the great church historians of the 20th century, George Hunston Williams, who was my major professor. And I saw in Williams so much of the Mercersburg emphasis. I'm not aware that he ever sensed any personal indebtedness to either Schaff or Nevin in the sense that he considered himself their disciples or their devotee. But he learned a lot about the history of the church from their scholarly writings and incorporated that into his own perspective, which in turn, for better or worse, was passed down to me. Church history as opposed to ecclesiastical history. This was a big emphasis for Philip Schaff. In other words, church history is a theological discipline. It's not merely the recounting of things that happened in the past. It's not merely history of Christianity. It is rather a study of the past in the service of the church. It doesn't mean your scholarship should be any less acute. You should do shoddy work just because you're a believer. But all of this scholarly work on the history of the church should yield to the service of God's people. In other words, both Schaff and my teacher at Harvard, Williams, refused to assimilate church history to secular history. And they saw the dangers in both historical reductionism, where everything is reduced to a kind of economic, sociological, political system of causation, what I'm calling historicist reductionism. And on the other hand, they also resisted confessional imperialism. That was the first thing. The second thing I want to mention is the plenitude of the church. We study in the history of God's people the church in its fullness, in its extent and breadth as well as its depth. Because the church is marked by, this is a term that comes from George Borofsky, a great Orthodox scholar, ecumenicity in time as well as ecumenicity in space. I quoted last night Philip Schaff's statement, "I am a Christian, therefore nothing Christian can be alien to me." In which, of course, he is paraphrasing the Roman author Terence, who said, "I am a human, therefore nothing human can be alien for me." Well, Schaff Christianized it. "I am a Christian, therefore nothing Christian can be alien for me." It's why he studied the Middle Ages and found some good things to crow about there. They took seriously the plenitude of the church. 3, and this is something I find extremely enlightening. It's a term I invented myself, but I think it describes both George Williams, my teacher, and also Philip Schaff. The principle of luminous particularity. Now, I know you have to say that once or twice, but think about it. Luminous particularity. It means that we take seriously every single event, every particular happening in the history of God's people, not as a kind of turned in on itself, separated phenomenon, but as a window, a prism onto a luminous landscape. Example: John Wesley's conversion at Aldersgate in 1738. Now, whatever you think about that, consider that his heart was strangely warmed at that Aldersgate meeting on May the 24th, 1738. In that Moravian prayer meeting he was attending, by listening to Peter Burler, the pastor, read a section from Luther's commentary on Romans, which in turn resounded with the joy of Luther's own breakthrough, which itself was a reenactment of that juxtaposition of legal dutifulness and grace experienced by Saul of Tarsus, before he was Paul the Apostle, on the road to Damascus, which, as Paul interpreted in a phrase purporting to re-echo the still more ancient word of the prophet Habakkuk, the just shall live by faith, Romans 1:17. So you see these strands of faith brought together in that one moment at Aldersgate. Habakkuk's prophecy, Paul's interpretation, Luther's grasping, Burler's preaching, Wesley's awakening. These are not discrete, separated, unrelated events, but together they form a mosaic of Christian faith. That's what I mean by luminous particularity. And finally, I'll close with this. Church history in the service of Ecclesia, Humanitas, and Cosmos. Nevin was a strong abolitionist. He opposed slavery and worked in a way to bring about its end. We've seen how Schaff was very involved in the Sabbatarian movement in New York City and throughout the country. There are other examples we could draw from their life of their commitment to bear witness to Jesus Christ in the real world of politics and business, the economy, culture. And so the church historian is not called to be a historicus odiosus, that is, a lazy historian, idle, looking down on events from the distance of a watchtower, but are called to be involved in the flow and flux of the events we seek to interpret. Put it this way: we study history in order to intervene in the course of history, and we have a right and a duty to do so, precisely because it is church history and not simply ecclesiastical history. For without historical insight, we either permit ourselves to be mere objects of the historical process, or we tend to mislead people in an irresponsible way. There's more to be said, but I've said enough in all these 4 talks. Thank you for your patience, your endurance, and for listening so well. Thank you.